Three images from nature dominate this first Sunday of Lent. The first is that of the desert. After Jesus was baptized, but before he started his public ministry, St. Mark tells us in today's gospel that the Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert, where he experienced temptation. Throughout the scriptures, the desert is often referred to as a place of testing, where we experience our weakness and our dependence on God. Water and food are hard to come by there, and the temperatures and emptiness are often oppressive to both the body and the mind. The desert is a place where our illusion of self-sufficiency and comfort fade away. When we are in the desert, either literally or figuratively, we quickly realize that we need God. In other words, the desert is the opposite of the Garden of Eden that we read about in the book of Genesis. It's the place of suffering and hardship that sin has led us to. Both original sin and our own personal sins that have interfered with God's plan for our lives and for our world. Those sins have put us in need of salvation. The second image in our readings is the flood, the abundance of water that cleansed the world of sin at the time of Noah. The ancient flood is a foreshadow of our baptism we heard about in our second reading, the flood of grace that purifies our souls from sin and brings new spiritual life to the desert of our sin-damaged hearts. This past week was a terrible week for both our city and our country. From the murder of Commander Bauer to the mass murder of high school students and their teachers, we all experienced the desert in some form or another this week. We know, too, that Jesus wept with us because God is love, and he never wants to see us kill each other. We are God's best creation, and yet many of us, myself included, turn away from his love so often. And some have turned away from God so much that they can't even recognize him in others, which leads to murder and other crimes against the flesh. Because of God's gracious gift of free will, he allows us, his children, to make terrible mistakes. However, his justice and mercy are still his to give if we seek it with a sincere and contrite heart. Besides the desert and the flood, there's another third image of nature in our readings today, the rainbow. Noah probably didn't know the scientific explanation behind rainbows, but he did know the spiritual meaning. All of creation has a physical nature that science explores and explains. But creation also has a spiritual meaning. It's a gift from God, a gift that's full of messages, lessons, and inspiration. Science can explain the prismatic refraction of light in a rainbow. I did have to look that up. I know nothing about that stuff. But science can't explain the thrill of wonder and excitement that fills our hearts whenever we see a rainbow. A rainbow appears when both sunlight and storm clouds come together. And God chose this as a symbol of his covenant, of his promise that salvation would conquer sin. My brothers and sisters, that promise still stands today. Jesus, as today's second reading reminds us so beautifully, has suffered, died, rose from the dead, and ascended into heaven, conquering sin and evil once and for all. The crucifix is our rainbow. The cross of Christ is our ark. No storm can cancel out Christ's victory over evil. No clouds can reverse it. No flood can extinguish it. And so while we suffer in the storms of hardship, like this past week, and the sins that make our lives and our world so painful and difficult, we still continue to follow Christ, because the light of his love shines brightly even in the midst of the storm. Today we have the privilege to renew our hope once again through this sacrifice of the Mass and by receiving Holy Communion, to be freshly inspired by a glimpse of our rainbow. When we see a rainbow in the sky, the first thing we do is tell someone else about it, either by taking a Snapchat or just hitting the person next to us and showing them that rainbow so that they will see it too and share in that joy. Well, friends, this Lent, let's do the same with that rainbow that shines in our hearts, especially for our sisters and brothers who are in the desert with no sign of hope, that our witness and our example will give them a glimmer of hope so that they can see the resurrection beyond the cross.